Story 1. I used to work for a very unpleasant manager at McDonald's. He was horrible to us. He constantly bullied us, talked negatively about us to customers, and did everything he could to make us miserable. So many people complained that he ended up getting fired. The new manager was great. He was calm and understanding. A couple of weeks after he took over, the former manager came in and started complaining about how terrible the store looked, how our service was worse than ever, and how the store needed him. The new manager said, "If you don't leave, the police will make you." When the former manager did not leave, the new manager called the police. The former manager is no longer allowed on any McDonald's property in the city and has a restraining order against him. Story 2. The first time I had dinner at my parents' house after I got my own apartment, my dad was giving me grief as usual. Finally, I stood up and said, "I don't live here anymore. I don't have to put up with you this way any longer. I'm going home." I walked out. It was the most liberating moment of my life. Story 3. Well, this might be a long one. I grew up with a mother who had dissociative disorder and narcissistic traits. She was addicted to opiates as far back as I can remember, and she would do anything to get them. Growing up, it was not rare for her to have a tantrum during one of her highs and beat the shit out of me, pick apart every little thing she knew I was afraid or self-conscious of, and sabotage my relationships with my father and siblings. She would be up for days at a time, pass out standing up with her eyes glassy and her back hunched, and when she came to she would start moving and destroying everything in the house. There were times when I would leave and the house would be clean, and come home to find it as though a pissed-off tornado had run through it. Broken glass, animal feces, dirty clothes, roaches, empty pill bottles, ground-up pill residue, and other miscellaneous things littering the floors. On particularly bad nights she would hallucinate, and during those times it would not be uncommon to find pools of her blood from running through glass. I remember being up for days at a time because she and my father would scream at each other without stopping, actively trying to get me to pick one side or the other, even barging into my room at 4 a.m. to begin their screaming match. She manipulated and abandoned me at times in the middle of nowhere when she met with her various sugar daddies while still married to my dad, and never once apologized during her brief moments of clarity. If anything, she blamed everything but herself. In her mind, she was infallible. Money was always a big issue since she could not work in such a state. She sold some of her pills, but ultimately those funds were used to buy more drugs. Because of this, we were homeless frequently, without power and water for years at a time, and we barely ever had any food. It was almost every night I went to sleep having eaten only a school lunch that day. On weekends, sometimes I did not eat at all. The rest of my family had no clue this was happening. The summer I was 16, my aunt, whom I had not spoken to in years, got in touch. She asked if I would like to come stay with them in Texas for a few weeks. Of course I said yes, and I was ecstatic. I did not bother asking my parents, since I would have been surprised if they even noticed I was gone. My aunt drove all the way to Iowa and stayed the afternoon with us. My parents seemed incapable of recognizing she was there, so they did not come out of their room. As often happened, when she arrived our house was fairly clean. We left for a bit to get food, and when we returned the tornado had already passed. On the drive to Texas, she told me that what bothered her most was not that our house had suddenly gone to hell, but that I did not even react to it. I had simply tiptoed around the debris and started packing my things without a word. This deeply unsettled her, and she asked if I was safe where I lived. I said yes because it was all I had ever known. She told me that what she had seen frightened her, and that she wanted me to come live with her in Texas. Thinking she was joking, I brushed it off, but after a few days there I knew I had to do it. They showed me love, compassion, and care that I had never known before, and it shook me to my core. So we decided I would seek emancipation and move in with them. Ultimately, this involved sitting in a courthouse across from my parents and their lawyer. The judge asked why I wanted to leave, and I explained the situation. I described the love and compassion I had experienced for the first time and said I wanted, for once, to live in peace. Their lawyer responded, "It seems to me that you have no respect for your parents. Is it because of their financial situation? It looks as though you are attached to the perks of living with a family that makes a reasonable amount of money, not that you want to leave because they are unfit parents." My mother and father joined in, hooting and hollering, trying to break me down as they had done so many times before. I let him speak, I let them speak, and I held my tongue until it was my turn. They tried to goad me, tried to break me, but I would not let them. Finally, the judge asked me to speak. With as level a stare as I could muster, I looked at my mother, my father, and their lawyer and said, "If you are asking me if I have no respect for my parents, then you are correct. However, to say it is simply financially motivated is incorrect. I no longer have respect for them because they have." As I was nearly finished, my mother began to squirm and scream from across the table. "He's lying. The little bastard is just." The judge slammed his gavel down and silenced the room. My mother stared up at him in complete disbelief. I kept the tears I had held back at bay and said, "For once in your life, for once in my life, behave as an adult. You cannot stop me by simply yelling over me anymore. You have nothing to hold over me now. You can do nothing." As I spoke, the judge motioned to his officer, who moved toward my mother. Her expression remained frozen in bewilderment as the officer told her to get up and escorted her out of the room. The judge looked at me, my aunt, my father, and his lawyer with one sweeping glance and then spoke. "I am sorry that you have had to deal with this for so long, young man. There is nothing more that you or anyone else needs to say. You deserve to live a normal life, and it is obvious to me that your parents are unfit to provide that kind of environment. You will go back to Texas with your aunt, and our social workers will check in regularly to see how you are doing. Make the most of this second chance. Good luck, young man." Adjourned. Though the bang of his gavel was the only noise that permeated the room, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. My father and his lawyer were escorted out, and the tears I had held back all this time came gushing out. It has been 7 years since that day, and I am happy to say that I have grown into a well-adjusted adult. I have a great career, great friends, and an amazing girlfriend. I have been in therapy ever since we returned to Texas, and I no longer have trouble sleeping or suffer the severe anxiety and depression I once did. Life is good. Summary: my mother, a narcissist with a dissociative disorder, was addicted to opiates and created a dangerous, unstable home. My aunt brought me to Texas. I sought emancipation, and after confronting my parents in court, I was granted emancipation and placed with my aunt. I have been in therapy and am now doing well. Story 4. I told my ex I was getting remarried. He said he would stop me and place a lien on the house I bought with my money 6 years after the divorce. My son came home from visitation saying his father would stop the wedding and demand money. At court, his attorney talked for what felt like forever. My lawyer stood up and handed the judge the divorce papers showing the disbursement of funds and that my ex was not owed anything. The judge asked the attorney if he had requested the document before filing and then dismissed the case. Story 5. A while back, I got a job as a popcorn monkey at the local cinema. A temporary thing while I figured out what I was doing with my life. There was a supervisor who had worked there since the site opened about 5 years earlier. She was unpleasant and had received numerous complaints from staff. In the first week, I nearly quit because of her attitude. For example, one night I was on a close and had cleaned the entire front of house by myself. I stopped to take a drink of water and she marched up to me and said, "We do not pay you to stand around drinking, you know?" I calmly replied that I was thirsty and needed a drink and that if she wanted to tell me I was not allowed a glass of water she could try, but I was pretty sure health and safety would have something to say about that. She complained that she had not had a break all day, which I ignored because it was not my problem, but I was annoyed because it was pointless to be so rude. About 2 weeks and I was promoted to supervisor because I was clearly competent by their usual standards. I could walk and fart at the same time, and she was promoted to floor manager, so she continued to take power trips and try to lord it over me and everyone else. For weeks later, I was promoted to floor manager as well, and at that point we were equals, so she could not boss me around anymore. Instead, she tried to assert superiority by showing off her knowledge of processes and where to find things. I responded sweetly, "Oh, thanks. That is so helpful. I mean, you know how things work so much better than I do, because you have been here 5 years and I have only been here 6 weeks. She looked furious. It was delightful. Story 6. My ex and I were moving out after a breakup and cleaning out the garage. She was critical of my plan to move in with a coworker until I could find a better place, since most options weren't great. I took a deep breath and laughed. She asked why I was laughing. I collected myself and said this was the last time I would have to listen to her criticism and that she no longer had the right to criticize anything I did. Felt great. I literally thought you have no power here as I laughed. Story 7. Summary. A pair of angry mothers threatened legal action after I fired their underperforming children. I work for a trampoline park franchise. We opened a sister location that I ran for about a year and a half before I moved back to take over the original location. When I returned, much needed fixing. In particular, 2 teenage employees had been fired or suspended multiple times. They were generally lazy and rude and should not have been hired. The problem was that both had aggressive helicopter mothers who intimidated the manager into rescinding discipline. Once I came back, I assessed our staff and had a long talk with the leadership team. I learned who caused which problems, who was unreliable, and who habitually skipped shifts or texted while on duty. I fired about half a dozen staff that first week, including the 2 I mentioned. That night, both mothers called my personal cell to scream at me. Our numbers are listed in the online scheduling tool, so employees can find shift covers more easily. They demanded to know why I had fired their sons, threatened to sue and to have me arrested, and accused me of discrimination against their white, middle-class sons. I replied, "Is your son over 18? Yes. So you are demanding that I illegally release personal information about a former adult employee? Goodbye." Story 8. Not my story, but a story my father used to tell me. My biological grandmother was very emotionally abusive. She was controlling and tried to keep people within her sphere of influence. There is a reason my grandfather divorced her. In high school, my father had a job washing airplanes at a nearby airport, which he absolutely loved because he was a huge fan of aircraft. He had classes until roughly 10 a.m., then he worked until around 10 p.m. He loved being around aircraft and did not mind the long hours. One day he came home a little too late for his mother's liking. She said she would take his motorcycle keys and that he had lost the privilege of using it. The fact of the matter is that he bought the motorcycle himself and he needed it to get to school as well as to work. He laughed in her face. She could not do anything. Story 9. I am a high school teacher who teaches many senior grades and therefore must deal with graduation grades, references for university, and similar responsibilities. A parent of a graduating student from my classroom came in June after final marks had been given to students but not yet formally reported. He is a dental surgeon in town, runs a large practice, and donates a lot to local sports. He is a prominent man in a small town. I had given his child a mark in the high B range. He marched into my office and began with, "There must be some mistake," which quickly moved to, "You are going to change it because I tell you to," and then, "How much will it cost to get him the A?" When I refused the bribe, he said, "You are fired," and told me to clean out my desk. I asked him to leave. It ended badly. He threatened violence. I reported him to the school administration, and he is now banned from the property. The parent who said, "I pay your salary so you work for me, you lousy piece of shit," was threatened with the police by me, Mr. Random Act PG. Story 10. Ooh, I have a story for this. I got married 2 years ago overseas because my wife is from Europe and they have cool castles and stuff. My Canadian family and friends all came because most had never been there. We were a little older and well off, so we splurged. The wedding was awesome, the dinner amazing, and the reception was in full swing. Quite frankly, it was a little warm for us Canadians. It was around 10 degrees Celsius in early November. When you mix in wool suits, drinking, and lots of dancing, some of us colonists were working up a bit of a sweat. Thankfully, the venue had a balcony with huge doors. I kept going over and opening them since some folks were inside and some were outside, and there was a nice breeze. But I had to keep going back because the doors were shut whenever I looked away. Finally, after the 5th or 6th time, this guy followed me and demanded I keep the doors shut because it was cold inside. I didn't know who he was, so he must have been a +1 of someone on my wife's side. I was mighty confused when he said, "Who the hell do you think you are, keeping these doors open and the temperature so low inside?" I'm the guy who bought you dinner. I watched him go over to my new cousin-in-law, grab her coat, and almost pull her out the front door. I thought one of my groomsmen was going to burst. He laughed so hard. Story 11. I was waiting for a friend to finish work. She worked at a restaurant so fancy they had someone vetting guests at a podium outside. The place was glitzy and the people were glamorous, so the great and the good would descend in droves. Those with a reservation were sent in. Prospective walk-ins had to queue. A car swept up. The driver jumped out and held the door open to reveal a woman in a hat and dress. The woman in the finery, a C-list actress from a regional daytime television show, looked through everyone present and moved to enter. She froze, appalled, when the person vetting guests intercepted her and asked, "Do you have a reservation?" She must not have heard the question because she did not respond. Instead, she drew herself up to the full height of her couture and demanded, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," said the maitre d'. "Back of the queue." Oof. Story 12. This is a bit silly, but it gave me a great feeling of satisfaction. Due to the bad economy and poor money management, my parents moved into the spare room of the house my husband and I bought a year ago. Things are mostly smooth, though I am not close to them for several reasons I will not go into here. The other evening I was gardening because it is hot during the day, and we are lucky to have a streetlight next to our front yard that keeps it well illuminated even after sundown. I mostly garden at night. I thought I had gotten the hose twisted because it kept getting stuck. This went on for a bit until I realized that it was not stuck but being pulled. I looked into the dim area beyond the streetlight and saw my father crouched over tugging the hose. I did the only reasonable thing and sprayed him. He yelled and ran inside with me chasing him. Once he got inside, he made a face and said, "You can't get me now. I'm inside." In that father-to-daughter, don't you make a mess tone. I readied the hose, looked him in the eye and said, "It's my house." Then I just let loose with the hose. He was soaked. It was worth cleaning up the mess for that moment of true fear in his eyes. Thanks for the appreciation. I am glad my silly story made your day better. Story 13. A woman complained that we would not fill her clearly fraudulent Schedule II controlled substance prescription and brought the new store manager back to the pharmacy to force us to fill it. The manager said we had to fill it. I replied that no one can make us fill a prescription that fails the safety checks. Story 14. The man I had gone on a few dates with introduced me to his parents. Things went well, or so I thought. After he drove me home, we kept talking and had a few beers. I did not want him to drive with alcohol in his system, and I enjoyed his company, so we stayed together until 3 in the morning. His mother began calling his phone, demanding that he come home. He drove to his house and found he had been locked out. She told him he could sleep outside, said he should not be spending time with someone like me, and called me just another stop on the pussy train. He told her not to speak about me that way, and she replied, "When you are under my roof, I will say whatever I want about whoever I want." He called me and asked if he could stay at my place for a little while. 7 years later, we are engaged, have a dog and a cat, and a happy life. I also plan to include subtle train themes in the wedding celebration after the pandemic. Story 15. I had a short stint as a private investigator, specializing in investigative services for public defenders. We had one county notorious for a sheriff's department that made bogus traffic stops as a pretext to search vehicles. One deputy in particular came up repeatedly for this kind of thing. I was asked to interview this deputy for a defense attorney. The deputy had some of the worst report writing skills I had ever seen, riddled with grammar and spelling errors. Quite often, the deputy would not even include the reason he pulled people over in his reports. I went to interview the deputy. As part of the process, a senior sheriff's representative was present to protect deputies from people like me and keep them from saying things they should not. We sat down and I pulled out the report he had written on the stop involving my client. I had already marked it up in red ink and began, "I had trouble understanding your report." I then went through each error to clarify the report. He grew increasingly agitated. I tried to determine why he had pulled over my client, because the report was unclear, but he could not give a definitive response. All the while, the sheriff's representative, whom I had worked with before and had seen vocally defend deputies, remained silent. Ultimately, the charges against my client were dropped. Months later, while driving home from camping and obeying the speed limit, I was pulled over by the same deputy. He recognized me immediately, stammered, and said, "It is almost dusk. Turn on your headlights." He returned to his vehicle and drove off before I had even started my engine. Story 16. I grew up with my parents having screaming arguments over every little thing. They do love each other. More than 50 years of marriage testifies to that, but it always upset me. A couple of days ago, they popped into my house for coffee on their way to stay with friends a few miles away. Within minutes, they were yelling at each other. I took great pleasure in telling them that I would not stand for such behavior in my house. If they did not lower their voices, they could stand outside until they learned some manners. The meek apologies tasted so sweet. So did the coffee. Story 17. A secretary in a branch of a state agency went on a power trip and stamped "Do not copy" on materials she sent to local agencies. I work for an oversight agency and needed a copy. Local staff were terrified, so I called and explained that they and I were essentially the same entity. The woman became upset but grew quiet when I interrupted and said, "Fine, I will issue a subpoena. What is your name and job title?" She gave her name and title, and the sheriff served her a subpoena for the records I requested. She was apparently not used to that. Story 18. My boss called me at 7 a.m. on a Saturday to ask if I could lay flooring for a friend of his at nearly half my normal rate. Hard pass, Andy. Story 19. Information technology services for a client of mine. They paid for me to come to their office and address a problem, with a minimum of 8 hours. The issue was resolved in about 45 minutes. They had set something up incorrectly, and it was obvious once I accessed the system. I was packing up to leave and the client stopped me. "What are you doing?" "The system is fixed, so I am headed back to my office." "No, I paid for 8 hours. You will do your 8 hours. If I tell you to wash my car for 8 hours, that is what you will be doing. Right? I am leaving. I will notify the office to send you the invoice, and in all likelihood we will no longer work with you and will withdraw our lease on our equipment. Story 20. I worked in management at a theater for a while. If the concession counter was slammed and I was able to help, I would leave my post and assist with serving popcorn. One night while helping out, a particularly belligerent man began yelling at a 16-year-old girl at the cash register for being too slow, even suggesting she quit because she could not handle pushing buttons or scooping popcorn. I felt bad for her and stepped in. I told the man that our employees have the right to refuse service to customers who harass them as part of our anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policy. I empathized that the lines were longer than usual and suggested that he apologize and move on. He was very angry. He left half his order on the counter and stormed off. Anticipating his next move, I returned to my original post that night as manager of the customer service kiosk. The look on his face when he saw me was obvious. He did not request a refund for his tickets, so I assume he watched the movie without popcorn. Story 21. I worked for 8 years servicing communications equipment on site, 5 of those years as the department manager. When oil was found in our area, we got so busy we could barely think. Most of my team were pulling 12-hour days 6 days a week, and we were struggling to hire people fast enough. One day, the chief executive officer texted that he had hired an assistant manager for me, which I desperately needed. I was filthy from my previous job and stopped by the store to pick him up and take him to one of our sites where he would be doing paperwork. The moment he got in the truck, he immediately started talking trash. He said everything we were doing was messed up, that the department manager, me, was a total moron, and that he would have my job within a few months. I mostly listened. He obviously knew nothing about my industry, and every time he said something wrong, I would politely correct him. He would either backtrack or insist I had been trained wrong. When we got to the site out in the middle of the West Texas desert, he complained about the layer of dust on everything and ordered me to clean up the entire site. When I sat down at my desk, he continued to complain about everything and chastised me for sitting down when he had told me to clean. So I called a taxi, filled out a notice of termination, and handed it to him. He looked absolutely shocked. He defiantly protested that only the chief executive officer could fire him. I asked, "And me, right?" He sheepishly nodded. I stuck out my hand, introduced myself, and shook his. I can teach anyone how to service equipment, but I do not know how to teach someone not to be an asshole. Story 22. That was a customer we had named Nick. I will leave his last name out to protect the stupid. He would email us and always carbon copied the editor at some national newspaper. Most of his messages were like, "Nothing fucking works." None of the national newspapers responded. I imagine some underling just rolled his eyes and deleted them. Finally he said, "Fix this in 5 minutes or I will cancel." My manager said, "Let me see that email." My manager responded, "Thank you. I canceled your account. We do not want customers like you anyway. If you want to contact the media, that is your call. I will happily provide the months of threatening emails you sent to my staff." He gave us months of headaches over a £45 per quarter account. We definitely did not need him. Story 23. When I was in high school, I worked at a popular warehouse club selling computers on weekends. I was hired by the store manager through a friend's referral. I loved computers and they thought I would make a good salesman, so my job was to stay in the technology department and sell computers, nothing else. One of the shift managers did not like that and started insisting that I fold clothes for part of my shift, sometimes as much as half. I told him the store manager had instructed me never to leave the technology department, but he insisted. This went on for several weeks. The store manager showed up one weekend when both the power-tripping shift manager and I were working. He walked up with the shift manager close behind, slapped a stack of green bar paper down onto a shelf, and pointed to some highlighted numbers. He looked at the shift manager and said, "Do you see this? These are our average technology sales numbers for the weeks you are on shift. See this number over here? These are our average technology sales numbers for the weeks you are not. At this point, it would be more cost-effective for me to simply fire you. What do you think of that solution?" The shift manager stammered like a toddler caught bullying another kid on the playground. Fortunately, he was not fired, but the store manager made it clear that when I was on shift, I was not to leave the technology department unless I was on break or there was a fire in the store. That shift manager never said another word to me. Story 24. I was not good at returning library books when I was a child. My school librarian lectured me about it a lot. 20 years later, I became a supervisor at the local public library, and my former school librarian, now retired, began coming there. One day, I saw her sneaking around the front desk instead of coming over to say hello, and I immediately guessed something was wrong. I went up to say hello. She seemed exasperated and told me she had been trying to avoid me because she had overdue books. I put on my reading glasses, pulled them down over my nose, and delivered the same lecture she had given me countless times about being responsible and returning books on time. Story 25. My boyfriend told me this story from when he was in middle school. It's kind of long. The school he went to didn't allow backpacks, same as mine, so students had to carry folders and binders to their classes. He had a cloth binder with a strap that went over his shoulder. What's funny in retrospect is that I also had one of these in middle school and never got in trouble for it. A few months into the year, he arrived at school using his strapped binder as usual, but the vice principal saw it and approached him. The conversation went like this. "Vice principal, you're not allowed to have backpacks. I'm going to have to take that from you until the end of the day." Boyfriend, "It's not a backpack. It's a binder with a strap." Vice principal, "Well, it looks like a backpack and it's on your back. Do you have any folders?" Boyfriend, "No, I don't. This is all I have." Vice principal, "Okay. You're just going to have to empty it and carry your papers to class until the end of the day." He wasn't having it. Like any middle schooler, he would just cram his papers in there and didn't want to carry a stack of papers around for 6 hours. He continued to disagree, and she eventually took him into the office. Vice principal, "Can I take your papers out? You can have it back at the end of the day." Boyfriend, "No." Vice principal, "Well, you're not leaving this office with it." Boyfriend, "That's fine. I didn't want to go to class anyway." This made her angry. She said she'd be back once he was ready to have a polite discussion and left. hoping he'd get bored and agree to carry the papers. But he stayed stubborn. After a while, she told him fine, just get a new binder after that day. He agreed, got up, and left the office. He never got a new binder. For the rest of the year, she would see him in the halls and say, "You can't have that." Each time he would reply, "Are you going to take me to the office?" He kept the binder all year. Story 26. I started working for a welding company as an engineering manager. We were selling an extremely complex weldment, a pressure tank that fits under a toilet, for $4,900 while our costs were $9,300. The owner took the bid to get in with a large customer and said, "We'll make it up in volume." We did not. The buyer for the larger company was difficult and would regularly yell on phone calls. We sent a letter saying we would honor the last 5 tanks on the current purchase order at the same price, though I did not want to do that. After that, the price would increase to $10,000 per tank. She drove down with her boss the next day, demanded an explanation, and threatened to pull the business. I replied that we were losing $5,000 per tank and could not continue. She demanded evidence, so I turned on the projector and showed the figures. I said we could not continue to make the part at such a loss and that I did not think anyone could do it at the original price. If they had to pull the business, we understood. Her boss interrupted, said they were not pulling out, and thanked us for honoring the current purchase order. I did not have many run-ins with her after that. Story 27. I was bartending one night when 3 guys were absolutely hammered, so I cut them off. One of them tried to argue, saying he had plenty of money, that he tells me when he is done drinking, and that he was not even drunk. At that point, I stopped being polite and told him I would not serve him or his friends and that he needed to leave. He asked, "Excuse me, who are you to tell me how much I can and cannot drink?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "The fucking bartender. Now it's time for you to go." The look on his face was priceless. Never forget the golden rule. Do not piss off your bartender. Story 28. I joined the Army Reserve in 1983, between my junior and senior years of high school. One drill weekend, we were conducting war games with another reserve unit. They mailed everyone a letter with the challenge and response required for entry. As a private, I was standing guard at the entrance and had to give the challenge. Everything was going well until a city police car pulled up and the officer was a newly commissioned second lieutenant. I gave the challenge and he just looked at me. I repeated it and he said to let him in because he did not know it. He began acting belligerently, so I asked him to turn off the engine and step out. He stepped out and started yelling at me. The sergeant major heard the commotion, came over, and harshly reprimanded the young lieutenant. I learned that day that although a second lieutenant technically outranks a sergeant major, in practice it did not matter because the sergeant major had 20 years of service and did not tolerate any nonsense. Story 29. A few years ago, a man stopped me in a hardware store and asked if I was a painter. I looked down at my painter's whites and said yes, I did historical restoration work. He asked how much I charged per hour, and when I told him, he immediately said I was too expensive and reduced my rate by 25%. I had already given him my number, but he kept belittling me and saying I was not worth it. I told him I already had a full-time job and this would be in my off hours, so it needed to be worth my while. He finally let me leave the store, then called 3 or 4 times, each time hemming and hawing over whether he wanted to hire me. He said he had a bunch of properties and it would be a sweet gig, but not at those prices. I kept telling him not to use me if he did not want to. Eventually, I recognized his number and stopped picking up. He really thought he had power over me and that I would jump at the opportunity. Luckily, I did not have to take the work. I was making good enough money already. He would have nitpicked everything and probably not paid me at the end anyway. He was so certain he would have the power in the situation that he could not comprehend me refusing to barter with him. Story 30. I once had a boss try to discipline me 3 months later after several of the group's chief executive officers noted I had been rude to her in a board meeting. On the disciplinary forms, both parties had to write their version of events and send them to human resources for adjudication. She did her part. I filled in a statement to the effect that my manager had continually pressured me to delete files from our client management system before a regulatory audit, which would have violated the ethical code of our profession and conflicted with my moral standards. I accepted that I had been short with her, but I explained that she was trying to force me to perform an illegal act. I watched her collect the paper and the color drained from her face. I never heard from Human Resources. She was dismissed shortly afterward when I mentioned the incident to the chief executive officer at a bar, explained why I might have appeared frustrated, and asked whether she remembered the encounter. Story 31. I worked in a cell phone store selling devices and service contracts in the United Kingdom. A young man, around 19, came in with a much shorter man who I later learned was his father. He wanted to cancel a contract he was partway through. From the way he explained it, I could tell he knew he could not cancel, but his father had brought him in to try to sort it out. The contracts clearly stated you cannot cancel early without paying off the remaining balance, which I explained. His father then erupted with anger, spitting, frothing, and hurling vitriol. He seemed to think that behavior would get results. I stared him down, waited for him to finish, and repeated the contractual terms as written. He shot back that he would report me for violating the Sale of Goods Act. That did not bother me because I had that law memorized. I had learned it after early customers tried the same tactic. Someone online had suggested using the term to intimidate retailers into conceding, so it came up often even when it did not apply. I said, "Sure, go ahead. You can even use our phone," and pointed to the store phone beside him. He had no case, and any trade commissioner listening would have dismissed his claim. After a moment of blank staring, he turned and stormed out, his son rolling his eyes in embarrassment at his father's tantrum. Story 32. If an unhappy client threatens to hire a better lawyer, they do not seem to understand that this is not a threat when they are not paying me. Story 33. When I worked in customer service for a restaurant delivery company similar to DoorDash, a customer complained about hair in their food. The hair was sitting on top of the food. I checked their account and saw they had one order, which was a red flag. I checked their phone number and found multiple accounts, each with 1 to 2 orders, all complaining about hair in the food. I denied a refund because the customer had used the exact same photo from a previous order and had ordered the same item. The customer argued and threatened never to use the service again. She ended the call and immediately called back. I handled the support request, recognized her, and denied the refund again. She called back a second time. The agent next to me took the call, and I showed them the account information so they could deny the refund as well. The next day she called again, this time outside the refund window, and demanded to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor reviewed the records and banned her for multiple fraudulent refund requests. Story 34. I worked at a grocery store for 5 years, putting up with difficult customers and their awful attitudes. At the end of my tenure, our store was set to be closed, and for the last month it was sold to a liquidation company. We were no longer under our parent company's umbrella and no longer concerned with retaining customer loyalty. For 1 month I could tell customers no and respond with sarcasm and disdain to every Karen I encountered until the store officially closed. Story 35. Obligatory. Not mine, but this video belongs in this thread. This is the best "you don't have power here" move I have ever seen. She was a government employee who had difficulty sitting with her baby on a plane. She tried to take the flight attendant's role, then played the Uno reverse card. Story 36. I work in a National Health Service hospital. No one pays anything out of pocket for treatment here. It is all paid for through taxation. A patient was added to our clinic who had paid one of our doctors for surgery privately at another hospital, but was receiving follow-up care free on the National Health Service. Technically, this should not happen, but it does. These patients can be difficult. Her appointment was at 8:55, before our clinic started at 9 o'clock. She had her workup done when we actually clocked in and was upset about waiting 5 minutes, despite the fact she was saving a fortune. Then one of the ward nurses called to say an emergency National Health Service patient needed to be seen urgently. So they were brought up and seen ahead of the private patient. The woman became very angry, shouting and crying that she had paid a lot of money and demanding service. Our charge nurse went out and asked who had taken money from her, pressing the patient to identify the person who had taken money. The patient blushed and stammered that she had paid the other hospital, And the charge nurse said that money was no good here and the doctor was being paid by taxpayers to see the emergency patient first. So she should sit down and be quiet or leave the department until she could be civil. Story 37. I worked at a movie theater. Some customers were adamant that a staff member had stolen their wallet after they dropped it. It turned out they simply could not see and found the wallet once they actually looked for it. They became angry with everyone, including mall security, managers, and staff. Mall security finally told them to get out. The customers protested, saying, "You can't say that. This isn't your theater. We are customers." The security guard replied, "This is my mall, and I can do whatever I want." Story 38. My parents came to visit, and my mother, who is very old-fashioned and believes a woman should be a homemaker and should not earn more than a man, told my wife, who earns a lot as a development team manager compared to my small income as a sports writer, "Dear, you really should try to keep a cleaner house." Without looking up from making lunch, my wife said, "Yeah, your son forgot to clean this week before you flew in." The stunned look on my mother's face was priceless. Story 39. The new chief executive officer arrived at our department on his first day. He did not have an access card yet, and a lower-level employee told him that he could not enter without one. The chief executive officer became upset and ordered an employee to let him in, but the employee insisted that he show his access card and refused to let him enter. A few days later, that employee received a bonus. Story 40. My dad is 6 feet 3 inches. I am 6 feet 10 inches. Sometime in my early teens, I shot past him. My dad was a yeller. If I was not doing what he thought I should, there was no discussion, just yelling. At some point, I realized he would not yell at me if he had to look up while he was doing it. I do not remember what our last argument was about. I just remember that I had caught on by then. I was in my room at the computer when my dad came in and started yelling. I stood up and started yelling back. My dad made an excuse to leave. He came back about a half hour later and started yelling again. But at that point, it was all I could do not to laugh. I knew that the instant I stood up, the argument would end. It actually turned out to be really good for our relationship because my dad realized he had to make valid points rather than just going into drill sergeant mode. Note: I unintentionally hit a raw nerve for a lot of people, and I apologize. I do not think I had it anywhere near as bad as some of the people who replied. If you find yourself in a situation where you have parents whose first response is intimidation or worse, look at how most people who responded eventually got out of the situation. Hang in there. It gets better, and you can find people who will help you if that is necessary. Story 41. I worked as a consultant for a company. There was some competition between a colleague and me. When the company began having financial problems, I left and started working for one of their clients. Shortly after I joined, they brought in the colleague I had competed with at my old job. He was technically my equal, but now I was employed by the client and he was a consultant. He tried to one-up me during meetings, and my boss told him that decisions are made by the company, not by consultants. Felt good. Story 42. It was probably watching a few Texas Department of Public Safety officers realized they couldn't shut down a whole airport. I was working as a flight instructor at a small airport on a Saturday afternoon. We had one plane that had an issue on takeoff, veered off the runway, cartwheeled, and was totaled. But fortunately, the pilot was not seriously injured. I had a student who was next in line for takeoff when it happened. He called me from his phone as it occurred. I hopped in the airport car with one of the ramp workers and drove out to the plane with a radio to inform inbound aircraft to use the other runway. We had no control tower. On the way to the runway, I called the airport manager, who drove to the scene and, on his way, made a phone call to officially close that runway. About 30 minutes later, a large number of Texas Department of Public Safety officers showed up and immediately tried to close the whole airport, treating it like a giant crime scene. They were carelessly driving around the airport as if they owned the place, ignoring the planes that were moving and crossing our only open runway without regard to inbound traffic. A mechanic and I tried to tell them to be careful, and they got mad at us. One of them said they were locking it down a couple of times, meaning the whole airport. I was a broke flight instructor, and I had a flight that afternoon that would ultimately help pay for me to eat that week. The airport manager was a short, stereotypical countryman and a former Navy service member. He was not intimidated at all by the officers trying to close his airport. When he showed up, I was about to go out with a student who was pre-flighting the plane for a cross-country. There were about 5 officers in the lobby, me with my flight bag, the airport manager, and a mechanic. One of the officers saw my flight bag and said he did not know why I had it or why I was out at the plane, that I was not going anywhere. The moment he finished his sentence, the airport manager said it was only one runway that was closed and the airport was still open. This angered the officers. I was about to head out the door when one of the officers said he was driving out to the disabled plane. I do not know why. The pilot had been gone for about an hour. The mechanic said they needed to be careful, and the officer quickly retorted, asking why that mattered. The mechanic replied that this was still an airport and the first thing that hits you is going to be a propeller. A few seconds later, a plane took off as one of the cars was approaching the runway intersection, illustrating that point. I walked out, and as I was getting in the plane with my student, the same officer came up to me and said we were not going anywhere because they were locking it down. I looked at the airport manager, who had followed us out to the ramp, and he said, "Have a nice flight, Ajax BU." You could see these officers fuming that they did not have the authority to close down an entire airport because one plane went off the runway. The airport had 2 runways. The disabled plane was probably a mile or so from the open runway. Why they were making a big fuss, I do not know. The occupant was relatively uninjured. His wife was the worst thing he had to deal with that day because he had told her he was not going to fly. We had a good flight and I got to eat dinner that week. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.